Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 69th episode of By-The-Bywater. Yes, it's
Nice.
the 69th episode.
So nice.
Yeah. Thank you both. It is great to be back with you all. I will fight the jokes. I will fight the response to the jokes.
Is it great?
It's
The 69th and final episode.
Yeah.
Greatness maybe is limited. Let's see. With that said, moving on. And we peace for all, especially now. We'll leave it at that for the moment. Anyway, but it is okay to be back with you all. How about that? And moving on from there, and we are just gearing up. And by the time this episode drops, it will be holiday wingdings, stuff like that. I have no plans beyond, vegetation. I think I will wrap myself up in a corner from the cold and do nothing. I think that's a really good idea. And hopefully we can all find similar peace that way. Anyway, so... Yeah, with that said, why don't we just plunge into, besides jokes about it being the 69th episode, why don't we just plunge into the news? There is some news, kind of. Not much. It's about one thing, really. Jared, please, take it away.
It's barely, but I think we've all had enough news.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
On so many levels. So there's not much to talk about beyond the forthcoming release of The War of the Rohirrim, with it coming out on the 13th of December, and all the promo ramping up now even more so. And there's all the usual stuff happening, a red carpet premiere in London on December 3rd, for instance, which totally makes sense for a movie with its writing team based out of New Zealand and its core creative team in Japan. But there you go. Its theme song, along with an accompanying video, has been released. The Rider, sung by English singer Paris Paloma, while the book of art from the film will be out in February, but pre-orders are available. There's other further contests and things happening, and that's all good and all. But instead of Denny's food menu tie-ins, we have Kung Fu tea drink tie-ins. It's something.
It's something. We were looking at this menu just now. We literally doing a double check. It's like, wait, is there a tie-in menu? And there is. So if you wanted Hera's Wild Lavender Punch or Riders of Rohan Lemonade, you know where to go.
What? Look, at least the Denny's Hobbit slams and stuff kind of made sense in that. I don't know if Hobbits ate pancakes necessarily, but, egg, sausage, like breakfast is a big deal in Hobbit communities. So, I can see it even if I don't like it. This, I'm not going to say I like or dislike. It's just a little odd. I know that, I'm guessing that it's sort of like, oh, well, Japanese creative, artistic team, they do bubble tea and other types of tea. So I don't know where the lemonade is coming from, honestly. Is there any mention of citrus at all when it comes to, Rohan and Gondor in particular? What is that?
I feel like, for me, this feels like a return to tradition in a sense, because I remember when the first movie trilogy came out, and it was like, oh, go to 7-Eleven for your Gandalf Slurpee cup.
The straw is Gandalf's staff.
Well, no, they had I can't remember specifically what it was, but it was like they had the characters on the
cups.
giant Slurpee cups.
Yep.
And it was collect them all, or the glasses with etched Frodo or whatever. I don't know.
I do feel like this happens a lot, I think.
Kind of weird that the only collectible item as such, at least in terms of the menu you can find on the webpage, is the canned black tea, the lemonade black tea. Everything else is just served in the generic cup. So. Yeah.
Oh, get that can and hang on to it, people. It's going to be worth so much in 40 years.
in the ruins of the Great Plains as the nomadic tribes wander, you use it as a totem or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
new fetish object. What is this mystery handed down from the ancients?
Yeah, the leader of the group is allowed one sip when they ascend to the position.
I mean, like 1,000 years or whatever from now, when people are excavating the ruins of America, they'll be like, they must have been so important because they were made to last.
Yeah.
These cups were made to last.
Yep.
They must have had immense ritual importance.
The Dune popcorn bucket.
This is a side note. This reminds me, if you've never read David Macaulay's book Motel of the Mysteries, I highly recommend it.
Sorry.
It is a very, very vividly hilarious demonstration about how basically archaeology only tells us so much because we lack so much context, and it does so very amusingly and very, very brilliantly. So we'll throw a link to that one in, but recommending that. Meantime, the theme song, Into the West, This Isn't.
Yeah, I mean,
this isn't
fine. It's Jared. You said kind of Florence and the Machine.
Oh, can we get Florence and the Machine? No, okay. Like it feels like somebody heard a Florence and the Machine song once 10 years ago and is like, I think I could replicate that. It's not like, I don't think it's bad exactly. I just find it so boring that it's irritating. But
yeah, Paloma.
Maybe I'm just in a bad mood too. I don't know.
Wonder why. Paris Paloma did not write the song, so we won't lay that at her feet. But the performance is sort of there. I mean, and I barely know her. I've vaguely heard of her. A younger English singer, like someone who literally grew up listening to people like not only Florence, but Ed Sheeran. I mean, think about that context. Someone who's young enough that you grew up listening to Ed Sheeran.
No, I don't want to think about this. What are you doing?
I'm sorry to break it to people, but
oh no. Sorry, I can't continue. I have to just have a little existential crisis right now.
Sit in my coffin. I mean, Ed Sheeran has been around in some way since I was in college. So
some form.
Yeah, well, I remember the first time I ever heard of him there was a cover of All Along the Watchtower that came out that he did, and I only knew about it because I was obsessed with Battlestar Galactica, and I was looking up everything related to that, which led me to this song. And I was like, who's this red-haired guy who's kind of interrupting this rap track? And that was like, I don't know, 2009 or something. So that was a while ago.
Yeah, so the premiere is coming, and we'll find out more, and it's all about to happen, and it's almost here. Yay, I guess.
I wish I were more excited about this, but I just feel kind of burned out on adaptations.
There's too many adaptations. Let's make an original movie, adapt somebody else. It's like, I know I'm on record multiple times as saying, I want adaptations to Tolkien that aren't like Jackson. And it's like the universe kind of heard me and was like only halfway and was like, not Jackson? Okay, so we'll get an animator to do it based on scripts written by
incrementalism.
Not quite my wish being granted. Yeah.
No question there. So it is.
What I meant was I want a shadow puppet theater adaptation, like that kind of thing, not just let's animate it and just make it look exactly like the Jackson movies. So
right. Yeah, well, here we are. So it is a thing. So we will see our results, and who knows what comes in the future. We've got those other films coming. Oh boy. Anyway, so
anyway. God, I forgot about that. I was like, what movie? What is he talking about?
Sorry.
I forgot too.
I realize you might wanted to blot it away, but there we are. So, okay, all right. We could go off about this, but we're dealing with angst as it is. So why don't we take a plunge into things to our main topic this time out, which is Jared's choice of topics. So please, the floor is yours.
Man, remember when we started this podcast? Those were the days. The heady halcyon days of 2019 when the world was young and so were we, or Oriana and I were. Anyway, nostalgia. I didn't anticipate this episode feeling so topical, and yet it does somehow. Like after an election that went awry, facing a future that terrifies a lot of us, it's very, very easy to look back at a year like 2019 and go, wow, we didn't know how good we had it. But 2019 sucked in a lot of ways. Like, I'm not going to list them, but I'm sure we can all think of some. And yet the impulse is to think it was better. And, it was in some ways, but we didn't have a pandemic yet, for one thing. Like, and then that impulse to be like, yeah, now sucks, but like, yesterday was good, is what that Tolkien taps into quite a bit. The impulse to think 2019 was good because 2020 sucked, that 2023 was better because 2024 is awful. Better for who? Right? And would you want to be stuck in 2019 forever because you personally were having a better time? Yes. Right? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. No, but so there are two strands of nostalgia, I think, that intertwine when it comes to Tolkien. One is in the real world, and to be honest, that could get hella depressing really fast, so I don't know how much time we'll spend on it. That's the strand that draws in people like Elon Musk or whoever, people who think, wow, weren't things great in the past? And the past they're thinking of is even more patriarchal. Women knew their place, and people of color weren't making a fuss about, hey, stop oppressing us. That like the return people. The which way, Western man, and because something like Lord of the Rings laments the passing of a better world, in the West specifically, they feel like it's speaking to them. Like, oh, the heights of Western civilization or whatever. The other strand, I guess it's not quite separate, but it's in the work itself. The Silmarillion opens with the music of the Ainur, which Melkor tries to corrupt, but Ilúvatar manages to take even the sound of lamentation and turn it into something beautiful. The text even points out that the beauty of the music, and by extension the world, is, quote, chiefly, unquote, because of the sadness. So how does that manifest? I mean, I think you could say the sadness is because there's a lot of tragedy in there. People are dying all the time in the Silmarillion. But sadness is a pretty big umbrella. I think it includes nostalgia, which is sort of a pale lavender form of sadness, but still. I mean, look at how nostalgia drives some of the most important moments in the work. Like Feanor motivates the Noldor by reminding them how good they had it in Middle-earth, where the Valar weren't breathing down their necks. Well, those were the days of our glory or whatever. Turgon builds Gondolin, not just as a place of refuge, but also to recapture some of the glory of Valinor, the traditional values. I don't know. The elves in Eregion create the rings because they see the world passing and want to preserve it or even reverse the decay. And Boromir is corrupted by the ring because Gondor in general is fixated on its past golden age and so on. The past is always an age of marvels, and the present is always rubbish. I will say, Tolkien does stack the deck a little by having places like Valinor or Numenor be actual pinnacles of achievement.
Right.
And granted, he complicates this by having Valinor be kind of stifling and portraying late period Numenor as like a resource-hungry empire. But the fact does remain that people who look backward in Tolkien, look backward in regret, are kind of, not wrong. Well, under the terms you set up anyway. And that in turn is what makes Lord of the Rings such catnip for those guys. Like, they want to believe there was a pinnacle of Western civilization, and they think he agrees with them. But does he? I'm going to say no, or not quite. I think he understands the appeal of that kind of thinking for sure, but I also think he recognizes that there is no going back. What was that? To qui vienen, there is no returning.
It's
and
literally
so on.
one of my tattoos.
Yeah. It's not possible to return to past glory, even if that glory existed. It's not possible. But in Tolkien, it's often equally a mistake to try to hang on to present glory, preempt nostalgia, as it were. Lothlorien is maybe the most benign example of this, and even then it's doomed to failure. Is this episode going to be a downer? Like, do we need to make more nice jokes? Like,
we could just sprinkle them in. We'll sprinkle them in.
Nice. Every time the conversation flags, just go nice.
Nice.
So we wandered away from nostalgia a little here. So I'm going to stop talking for a second and ask, what do you wish you could experience again for the first time? From Tolkien, obviously. And also keep in mind, the answer to this question will inevitably trap you in a hell of your own making.
Damn, found out. Well, I mean, in terms of experiencing Tolkien for the first time, I mean, this for me is actually pretty easy, and that is distinctly remembering Christmas '83 when, having asked for it as a gift, I finally got a paperback edition, the early '80s paperback edition of the trilogy. I was already read The Hobbit a number of times, and so this was me finally tackling the big one. I remember I was prompted partially by my would have been 8th grade English teacher. Think that sounds right, because he had various Hildebrand illustrations of Tolkien on the wall from one of the calendars, and that sort of made me think, I gotta finally. I very distinctly remember being holed up in bed during Christmas vacation late at night, just reading through and going dang and all that. So I mean, there's a certain nostalgic sensation about that, that first full-time encounter, and so I would add that in. And does it provide a certain sense of, oh, it was wonderful back then? Nah, the ending years of the Cold War, nuclear tensions being what they were. 1983, I was there. I remember some horrible stuff floating in the air. Let's put it that way. So and there were bad things that happened that year. So I can't look back at that and go like, gee, what a wonderful time. But it's one of those things that you sort of find your little context to be in that. If I want to sort of comparative example. I cannot remember the exact title of this. I think it's called Comfort and Joy. Whatever it is, I'll try and throw a link and mention in the show notes. But it's John Boorman's film about growing up in London during the Blitz. And from the point of view of being a kid and being like, wow, this is all so exciting. I mean, there's the new Steve McQueen movie out, which is looking at the Blitz arguably much more soberly. But this is Boorman looking back as a kid going like, I actually was kind of entertained. It was one of those things I'm like, people look at things through different lenses. So even when they're objectively horrible. That's something to consider there based on your age and all that and things like that. But I'll stop there. Oriana, your initial thought to that question?
Yeah, I do wish that I could go back to reading the books for the first time because I read them the time between me reading it for the first time and seeing the first Jackson film is very short. And that era of my life was also I don't have a lot of great I don't have a lot of solid memories from that point in time. I very quickly watched the movies and devoured the Silmarillion and every sort of bit of lore I could get my hands on, and I wish I could go back to a more ignorant time. Yeah. Which is perfectly in line with what Jared was talking about, where Ned, what you were just talking about, the human capacity, and I guess also the elvish capacity in fictionally to adapt to horrifying situations. I think a lot about something I read, and I think it was a writer from Beirut who has, wrote about bombs are falling, but we still have weddings. We still, we go to a nightclub, even though part of across town, a school was bombed or something. You just have to kind of continue on amidst horrible things. And I think that actually really aids our sense of nostalgia. And I think Tolkien taps into that really well and really astutely.
My response to the question would be I miss when I was 13 or whatever and found the Silmarillion for the first time and had that sensation of oh my god, there's so much more, and chasing various elvish words to following to the index and then being oh, that's what that means, oh, okay, and then kind of going back to Lord of the Rings and being oh my god, I understand so much more now. I miss that. I do think it's kind of interesting that you've both talked about maybe times when you were more ignorant, nostalgia in a way is I want to go back to a time where I just didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever age that was for me, I was 2001, 2002. I didn't know anything about the world. And I kind of miss not knowing. Awful shit was happening. And I remember some of it, but I was still it's the golden age in some ways. For me personally, the rest of the world, no, but it was nice that all I had to worry about was not being able to find a copy of the Silmarillion that had all the pages.
But I think that is something that taps into what you're talking about. And what I think is one of Tolkien's most interesting, you could say, nostalgic tricks in a weird way in Middle Earth involves exactly the story of the hobbits, where it's sort of he creates in the Shire idealized, Merry England, if you will, pre-technological, just so, and everything's, just sort of calm down and all that. There's just your local pubs, your farmers and all that. So arguably there's a certain, temporal Arcadia there, although, focused instead on not the actual Arcadia, but just an imagined semi-rural England, just maybe within living memory, as he's talked about himself, but maybe even further back to more 18th century than 19th, if you will, or something like that. But in the context of Lord of the Rings, it's not nostalgic, it's present. It is, and the Hobbit's past is more sort of we came from a place over there, but nobody is nostalgic in the Shire for where they were from.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about, at least, overtly, nobody talks about that. You do get a sense of like history and events, but there it's notable because they are so major and so potentially tragic. There's the forebear of Tolkien, the forebear of Bilbo and Frodo, who was the one who the bull roarer took, who
invented golf.
fought off the orc invasion. There's also the time when there's talk about some more in the appendices when white wolves invaded the Shire, and there was sort of a battle against that. So there's a sense of having to struggle against things. But the Shire has been sort of in continuous stasis present for centuries, in essence. And as a result, nobody looks back on those times going like, wasn't it great then? It's more like, no, it's just the way things are. Arguably, that's where the function of the scouring of the Shire and the great interruption of this whole stasis comes in. All of a sudden, you do enforce a certain nostalgia, but at the same time, it's one that's that stasis is returned to very quickly, and everything seems to be quote unquote normal again in this new setup. So it's sort of interesting how it functions in that way that would not be functioning in many other ways. It's something like it's almost like nostalgia doesn't even exist as a concept, a feeling, a thought, anything like that in the Shire until maybe potentially that moment, and even then, it seems to only be a temporary interruption.
Yeah, like they haven't lost anything, so how can they miss it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that stasis, I think it's bound up in things we talked about before, like the impulse towards isolationism in a lot of these things. Like, but what a lot of these people, like the elves, want is like, it's a positive impulse. It's like we want to heal the world and bring it back to what it was before evil came. But their inability to accept that they can't is why a lot of stuff goes wrong.
And like, it is all for the elves and the men, like, it is kind of funny to have, like, for the hobbits, any kind of temporary yearning for the time before Sharky's men showed up is like, it's totally valid because that is like objectively better than what they're going through right now. Whereas for the elves and the men, elves in particular, it's like, the world was ruined before you got here. Like, that is kind of the whole thing. Like, you guys woke up in Cuiviénen and started getting snatched. And, there were monsters around. And I'm not saying the Valar did the right thing, but, the impulse to move you guys was predicated on this not being super safe for you. Whether that was right or wrong, but it's really interesting to me that Tolkien, like, very astutely constructs these myths the elves and men fall back on when they evoke nostalgia, while also being kind of you cannot necessarily separate nostalgia from conservatism.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
Right. Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that, like, he knows that this is all, a yearning for an imagined past, even while being a sort of small c conservative himself. That's interesting to me.
This would have been a very different book from a very different writer, but I wish he had done more with the function of memory and history and its role in nostalgia. Because what humans look back on as like, oh man, wasn't that great, is often something that was before they were born. A lot of the like real world people who were like, we have to return to traditional values or whatever, were born in like 1995. Like, they don't remember the 50s. They know what they think about the 50s. Whereas the elves were really around for a lot of the stuff that they want to bring back. Again, it would be a different book by a different writer, but the way that Gondor thinks of its past may not necessarily be the way it actually was, or the way somebody who was there remembers it. And how does that affect how you act?
Well, I'd argue that in some respects that is his version of the criticism of it, because he says more than once, and I think, arguably from the perspective of men rather than elves, perhaps for obvious reasons, but he basically says that both Numenor and Gondor essentially fall prey to a similar thing. This is, it's slightly touched on in the extended version of Return of the King film-wise, but in terms of the actual writing, Numenor more especially. But Gandalf says it in Return of the King as well in the book about the idea that eventually both societies get to the point where they're looking back on lineages, where they're really interested in constructing tombs, and this idea of just preserving something, holding on to something. In both cases, it's interesting how it's slightly divergent. In the case of Numenor, they get more and more of a utter world power, hyperpower sense, and yet they're even more obsessed with clinging on, holding on, making things sort of like just tracing their history and being like just holding on to that. Whereas in Gondor, it's always been a sense of, all right, we started with a glorious victory, a hard-fought one by destroying Sauron, destroying Mordor, and all that. And ever since then, it's been 3,000 years of just slow but sure grind down. So for them, they're feeling it from the other direction. It's sort of like, oh, it really was better times back then. So, and in both cases, Tolkien is clearly regards it as incredibly negative. He just he sees them in both senses, I would argue, as a sort of abandoning of the present in favor of this sort of like obsession with past and preservation, which again is interesting given Tolkien's small c conservatism. It's something that he's clearly not a pestilent innovator, let us say, but to borrow a phrase, but he is one for like reading things as they are in the moment, however much through his own particular lens. And I have to wonder how much of that may be from, I don't know. There could be some that could be part of the continuing impact of his World War I experience. I don't know. So, but that could be an element of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that he doesn't talk about it or think about it at all. It's more that if this were the point of the book, it would. Okay. I think it would be handled a little differently. And I think, again, a different author might do something else with like an elf who remembers how Gondor began or whatever, and is like, you guys weren't that great, or like you're remembering. You were great for these reasons, and you're remembering the wrong ones. Like something like that. I'm not saying that would be better or worse. I'm just, if that were the point, it might be told differently. Is all I'm.
Yeah. Speaking of the elves and memory, elves, their sleep is basically wandering through memory, right?
That's right, yeah.
Right? Yeah, like their dreams are just kind of...
Yeah, they can just kind of walk around with their eyes open, remembering things, and that's kind of sleep for them. Which, like, I'm trying to imagine the effect that would have on you as a person who, like, you live forever, more or less, and you have, like, increasing store of memory, and in order to, like, heal your body, like, restore your body to how it's supposed to be, you just kind of remember stuff, and how depressed like most elves would be, like, because they're not like human beings, which I guess is why they aren't all depressed, but I think that is why they all seem sad,
they can't get away from reality. Question, nothing to do with nostalgia, but do elves ever write fiction? Are they capable of fiction? Because if they don't dream, if all they experience is reality, can they... I mean, I know they can lie, but would they write a novel?
Oh, that's really interesting, because like all of the examples of songs that we have are based on Whoa.
Ironically enough, given we had our Adventures of Tom Bombadil episode a couple of months ago, that those poems in there, and yes, the real world origins we know, but the point is that maybe as close to fiction in a quote unquote Middle Earth context as Tolkien allowed itself to be. There's you get the occasional like folk tale. Like, for instance, the Druidine and the idea of the faithful stone. He specifically introduces that in the bit in Unfinished Tales as something that was seen to be like a tale, as opposed to necessarily something that happened in reality or necessarily one-to-one truthful. And that itself is in retrospect an incredibly rare instance, just as Jared was saying, is something that seems to be like not a cultural memory of a story rather than an actual documentation of some sort of the past.
Yeah.
The only other example I can think of right off the top of my head of something sort of similar to that is the song that Treebeard sings. There's an Elvish song about like the dialogue between the Ant wife.
Right.
And even then, it's like what they think might have happened in this historical event, and it's not portrayed as like this is fiction written. It's not historical fiction exactly.
Yeah.
It's closer to that than it is to an actual fiction. Anyway, there's a kind of a tangent, but
That's
it's just
so
like
interesting, though. Like, because the cat and the cat and the fiddle song that the hobbits sing feels sort of fictionally.
It's just a
but
Hobbit thing.
It's a Hobbit
Right,
thing.
yeah.
Like, but do like the men of Gondor even or Rohan? Do they write fiction? Oh, this is so okay.
Yeah, do they have stories? Would they have stories set in a moment in a glorious period of the past? You know, say like the equivalent of a Byzantine emperor with the furthest extent of holdings, and they go back. Oh, that was a glorious time, and here's a story about a particular warrior and their most vaunted achievement during that time, something like that. And I mentioned the Byzantines comparison because there is at least one. I can't remember if it's a novel or more of an epic romance poem, but the idea is it is not meant to be a realistic story, but it's supposed to be something about on the borderlands, etc. And it was during that time. Although, if I remember right, it was during a later phase of the empire, looking back on a slightly earlier one, which is an example again of nostalgia. But nonetheless, that is an impulse, and you're right. We don't see that. That's a really interesting framing. The more I think about this, the more it's like that really opens up a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Just picturing an elf watching a David Lynch movie and being like, "What? Did that happen? Can that really? Is that what?" And then,
why would you tell lies?
And like having to explain dream, like this is what dreams feel like, and an elf being like, "No,
come on,
a dream
man.
is like your first birthday party all over again."
That's not how any of this works.
Yeah.
But like it is interesting because nostalgia also does perform like it is like a social glue as well though like it is a like nation or society building tool, or it can be. And like again, I use tool as like a value neutral, like that is neither good nor ill. It is just a thing that societies do in order to form a cohesive group of people, which we do see that a lot in Tolkien.
This leads me to sort of maybe introduce something else that would be worth considering, is that we logically are talking about nostalgia of the functions of Middle-earth, but it's worth considering the non-Middle-earth work in this regard, which we've covered a lot of. We haven't covered everything, but we've covered a lot of the major ones. And just as reminders, we'll throw in links to episodes on things like not so much Leaf by Niggle, because that's more seems to be set in a current time as anything else, but Farmer Giles of Ham and Smith of Wooten Major are arguably more comic and more serious explorations where nostalgia has a place. In Farmer Giles, it's much more like, an imagined old England that was like this. And again, he doesn't really dwell on that. It's more so like a setting for adventures and wacky things happen, big philological jokes and other things like that. So, and some interesting characters. So a little less serious there. But Smith of Wooten Major, arguably, there's a sense of, personal nostalgia in the character of Smith. The idea that Smith was this kid who basically got the gift to be able to visit, the land of the elves and all that, and now has to go through a life realizing he's reached a time where that will have to be given up and passed on to someone else. And it's not an overriding theme in any sense, and it's not really totally framed that way, but there's clearly an element to it where he has to realize that, he can't go back and he has to let things go, and he will have the dream and memories of it. But that'll be the extent of it. So, it's interesting that he maybe puts the framing of that much more concretely in something that's not a Middle-earth story in this particular regard, because, there's certain resonances maybe to his own life. Again, that was one of his last works that he did just a few years before he died. You can read everything you want into that, but, there you go. That could be part of it there, too.
Yeah, I think the reason it works differently in non-Middle-earth stories literally might just be that he conceived the Middle-earth stories as being part of like the music, which is always moving forward, and to resist that is kind of literally to resist God's will.
Yeah.
And the real world is obviously not quite like that, even if you are Catholic.
Sometimes, especially.
I've never been Catholic. Yeah. I also think it's interesting how the Inklings appear to all have been drinking the same water. Where like there's a whole thing in C.S. Lewis, specifically Paralandra, where like you shouldn't repeat a good experience just because you want to have it again. You have to like wait and see if it comes back. And in like E.R. Edison, it's not quite the same, but there's a sort of like everything has to keep moving because stasis is death.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know, like, they're obviously, all three of these guys are putting totally different spins on the idea of trying to hold on to something. In Edison. So I'm going to be on a podcast talking about Edison's Mistress of Mistresses.
Cool.
In a little bit. So maybe we'll link to that in the show notes, because I don't know when it'll be out, but we'll find out.
We'll see.
And the main character paints portraits of his wife constantly, and then when she dies, he destroys them all because he doesn't want to trap those moments any longer. Like, if she's no longer alive, her image should be allowed to decay as well, which is, you know, Edison is obviously a very different person doing extremely different things with the idea of what you should hang on to.
Rather, or what to celebrate or things like that. Yeah.
But what was in the water? Why were they all, not all, but a lot of them, why were they so fixated on this idea of, like, you know, letting things just happen and not trying to force cats back into bags constantly?
Well, you know, again, not to necessarily invoke World War I again, especially sort of like,
you might as well.
I mean, you could. I mean, I forget what Edison's own experience was, but of course Lewis served as well. And it's interesting because, you know, there's the, you know, to borrow a thing for another editor, Robert Graves' famous book about, right, that was, you know, farewell to all that. In other words, that was the past looking beyond and all that. So it's sort of like a deliberate rejection. So maybe for both Lewis and Tolkien, and probably others as well, it's almost sort of a recognition, and I'm now going to borrow from another writer from a much different context, Dorothy Parker, the idea that, you know, you've gone through here now, and as she said in one of her stories, you might as well live. and in that context, the idea that nostalgia is a sort of not quite a living death, but you're just sort of like, you know, you're eternally preserved, which, hey, if you want to lead to one of the most famous comparisons, you know, Bilbo saying about how it's like, you know, thin, stretched out, you know, you're existing, but you're not, you can't move, is what it is.
Yeah.
And it's a weird, because you become nostalgic for a previously mortal self in a weird sort of way where you're unenslaved by the ring. And you could argue that there's an interesting thought to be maybe had there too about what are, like, the Nazgul like. Do they yearn for their past and all that? We have the sense in the Curse of Mandos, leaping around a bit, but hear me out, to when he says things like, you know, you'll go to Mandos, you will yearn for your bodies, is what it is. You're trapped in Mandos. The ring wraiths are trapped in the regular world, in Middle Earth, and their physical forms are long since gone. They're just, you know, weird shells and all that. Do they feel twinges of, you know, remembering what it was like before they were enslaved, before they became wraiths? Is that even part of what's there? It's a very, you know, weird way maybe to think about nostalgia, but this sense of yearning, the fact that Tolkien brings it up in the Curse of Mandos context, is a very interesting one, because to be nostalgic is, in some respects, to yearn, to desire and look back. It's sort of like an interesting, tiny little framing that maybe is more suggestive than intentional, but still.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the definitions I saw was like it's a wistfulness for something that has happened, like real or imagined.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's not necessarily like I think I've been stuffing a lot of things into the like umbrella of nostalgia here that maybe are maybe more extreme than most people tend to think about it. But yeah, I think the rings themselves are not an example in a sense, but I remember when Mom was reading this to us for the first time, all those years ago when I was so little and innocent and didn't know anything. And the chapter, The Shadow of the Past, Gandalf is talking about the rings, and he's talking about them as a whole, like a mortal who possesses one of the great rings is gonna suffer. Like, it doesn't matter if it's the One Ring or not. If Bilbo somehow had Galadriel's ring, it would be the same, because these rings, even if they're like good and powerful and beautiful and whatever, and they're for preserving life and things like that, it's still toxic. It doesn't matter what the purpose is. Once you try to stay in a moment, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, like the ring wraiths appearing, you know, their disembodied forms have crowns. Like, that's pretty, I feel like that's a pretty powerful indicator that, Ned, I think they do feel nostalgia for
Remember when we were
when
in
they
charge
had
of something?
bodies,
Yeah.
when they had bodies, when they like really commanded, like now they feel just kind of like errand boys, it feels like they don't get a lot of respect, a lot of fear, but I feel like no one actually likes them. So I bet.
Well, the orcs sure don't.
Yeah, exactly.
They talk about that more than once. So the apple of his eye, things like that. So
I don't want to read too much into this because I don't know if I want to try to spend this much time on making some kind of connection. But it is, Ringwraith's greatest weapon is despair.
Yeah.
So
does that have anything to do with it? I don't know. That's like an entire other hour maybe of trying to figure out if there's a connection or if it's just because they're undead.
They just weren't shades.
Yeah.
Go on, Oriana.
Oh, Ned, you were talking about World War I, but I do think that the rise of the extremely nostalgic for times that did not exist movements of the 20s and 30s in mainland Europe were like a pretty big effect as well on all of those guys. Just seeing this weaponization of nostalgia and what it can do when applied en masse by the worst people to exist. I think that can be pretty influential.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happened right after World War I in the arts specifically, where a lot of people were like, you know what, the old world screwed up. We're going to build a new one, and that's where you end up with like the modernist movement with the architecture that's just rectangles and all that, because they're like ornament, thing of the past. The past is dead. The war killed it. We got to move on. And having these people, Tolkien, Lewis, other people specifically being like, in their own way resisting that, like we're going to do things that are very much set in the heroic past or whatever, but we're also not going to pretend that that's the right place to be. Like even as they're resisting modernism, they're questioning the traditions that they're trying to rework, which is a very interesting moment to see. I
mean, I think it says something that, for instance, that, Tolkien more explicitly in his failed preface for a George MacDonald edition that basically made him realize how much he had moved past MacDonald, but Lewis as well, are writing, sort of like their own versions of, Christian stories, however defined for both of them, obviously more explicit than Lewis and more deliberate, nonetheless are not trying to be George MacDonald over again. They're not just simply writing, pastiches. It doesn't work, is what it is. And they're sort of like, no, we need to, place ourselves where we are right now rather than just simply going over another course. Again, more limited, granted, in Tolkien's case, as compared to Lewis's, but I think it's instructive.
Yeah, I think in some ways we're in a similar moment now where a lot of people are like, a lot of things have failed us.
Right.
But their response is, and I'm not condemning this necessarily, is like, well, I'm going to, even if it's not a conscious response to this, it's like, well, I loved this book, so I'm going to reiterate it myself.
Right.
I'm going to write something because I loved this, and not quite move past it, or like the explosion of fan fiction or like adults fixated on constantly watching kids programming is, I think, a symptom that like this is safe. This like Steven Universe is safe, and like I love Steven Universe. That's not a knock on Steven Universe.
But yeah, I take what you're saying.
The self-infantilization that I see happening a lot. Like, and that's not to say that that's all anybody is doing, but there's a significant number of people who are working with not even unquestioned nostalgia, because they're like, I loved this thing, but it was very white and straight, so I'm going to make that, but add queer characters, people of color, that kind of thing. But not necessarily question whether or not this is a project in some way worth doing, and it's not worth doing, but they're not. This is a very blanket statement, and a lot of people might be mad at me for it. I'm trying not to sound like I hate this kind of thing, because I don't. But questioning the very motive of like looking back is what they're not quite doing. They're like, I want to look back and remake it in a way that's acceptable, but not like, should I even be doing that? Should I maybe be moving forward? I don't necessarily see that questioning. And that's not that you have to do it. I'm not saying this is how
Right.
you have to write fiction. This is not prescriptive. This is just an observation.
Yeah. This makes me wish I had seen. I do want to see I Saw the TV Glow. I just haven't gotten around
I
to
just
it.
watched that a few weeks ago.
It's very,
This
very
feels
good.
very,
It's
very
good.
relevant to this conversation.
It is. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Since you haven't seen it, I won't say more.
Yeah.
But yes.
I will do that.
To see how nostalgia functions in that is,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that, giving nothing away, and I think you're still keeping the discussion. It's the type of thing that even aside from the very strict, I shouldn't say strict, the very specific, rather, thematic drive of what the movie is arguably about, the wider message in there about, you could say, nostalgia for what you thought you were experiencing versus what you were actually experiencing.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it at that.
Well, that is a huge, I kind of had that in something similar to my notes about like, what the past and what you think about it and what you want to return to, like there's often a difference between what you think happened and what actually happened.
Right. So I suddenly had a flurry of thoughts about something rather randomly specific, believe it or not, based in the original Battlestar Galactica series in a book that was a spinoff, but I won't go there because that is far too afield, although maybe it'll be something I'll bring up later, although it's interesting. It's an interesting moment. Thinking more on some other things, and also maybe keeping a slight eye on the time, or starting to draw near our usual amount, and all. Maybe a last thing I'll throw in there. I may take a second to sort of like formulate it here. Best is that in terms of nostalgia, there's a meta nostalgia on top of it, looking at Tolkien himself. You could say through all of us, there's a nostalgia for a lot of people. I think more my age and older. And looking back on the time when you could say Tolkien was the unquestioned king. You could say, of the certain realm and all that, and everything went through that. We've touched on this before in various episodes in various ways, but it's almost sort of a sense that instead of Tolkien being an individual author as part of a wider context who created his work, the idea instead was to sort of so valorize Tolkien and so valorize his work that it's almost like sometimes I think a lot of people like, why can't we go to the back and have it always be at the center, as opposed to being like, no, there are nodes and there are different developments and there are new intertwinings and weavings and things like that, and placing him more in these wider contexts is to a better benefit and to better understand his work, as opposed to treating him as some sort of like, when you, at the time, going back to, again, to me as that like kid in 1983, it's like clearly the best thing ever, and everything else is sort of like that. You can't return to that state. It's as much as nostalgia for the reading, but it's also return to nostalgia for the idea of that sort of level of valorization, which Tolkien himself would have never asked for. I never got a sense that he was ever after that.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, he was just, it's something, and it's his legendary line about the deplorable cultist. He's like, making me the focus of everything? No. And so there's the nostalgia. There's this, as I said, meta nostalgia about Tolkien as phenomenon. You could say, as Tolkien as in a very specific context that is now no longer the case. The genie is long since out of the bottle. It can't just simply be your particular secret that's simultaneously well known but not well known enough, so you can see sort of like, I keep the secret knowledge. It's gone now. It's not how it works. So, and I'll end there.
I think you do see a similar nostalgia among people in our generation and younger, where they're like, their first experience of fantasy may have been the Lord of the Rings movies, and now they're like, oh, Game of Thrones, everything is so dark now. Oh, why can't we go back to when fantasy was happy and cozy? Yeah, and it's like, well, you're doing a disservice to the thing you claim to love by acting as if it was simpler and cozier.
Right.
But also, like, and this is maybe where I personally want to wrap up a little bit, is like I see people sometimes act as if because they loved that thing, that is what should be happening.
Right.
You only want, oh, everything is so dark, why can't we have the safe fantasy? Like, the world is terrible, why can't we have the safe fantasy? We have to go back to the safe fantasy. All I want to see is safe fantasy. On the one hand, it's hard to begrudge people a little bit of comfort in this world. Not saying that, but it's easy for that line of thinking, especially if you have power, to turn into everybody has to want the things back that I want back. And if you have the clout to do that, then it's going to suck for a lot of people, even if all you're doing is being like, I want everything to be cozy fantasy forever. It's like, no, I kind of want, like, I wrote a book with cannibalism in it. That's not like, okay.
True.
What are you going to do? Although my editor told me it was a comfort read for him, so whatever. But, whatever that
I grew up a
tells you.
cannibal. This reminds me of home.
Oh, Mellified Man is the taste of my childhood.
Oh God! Every Saturday night, Mom would pull out the old lead-lined coffin, hack off a chunk of the guy.
Wonderful. Any final thoughts on the subject, Oriana?
Yes, I don't think there are any fascists listening to this podcast. I don't think anyone who leans even slightly to the right listens to this podcast. They have,
oh God, can you imagine?
long ago been driven off by us. But I will say that it will never stop being a bummer that, far right wing, fascist, totalitarianist, whatever, shitty people are doing the exact same with Tolkien's work that he would have hated in so many different ways, including the weaponization of nostalgia and the use of his work to weaponize nostalgia for a past that never existed and which Tolkien himself, indicates never actually existed. I'm going to say a bad word. World is a fuck, and it always has been.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tolkien understood.
If you're longing for the past that he lived in, like the 40s and 50s, you can look at his letters. He was like, this all sucks. I hate what's happening. Like, what do you want to have happened? It didn't.
Right.
Whatever you think happened was wrong.
Okay, time to come around to the next choice of episode topic, the first one for 2025. The choice of topic comes around to me. So, if you've been one of our regular longtime listeners, you know that I normally start off the year by focusing on something Tolkien did out of Middle-earth, looking at various other things, as I mentioned the short works earlier. But in this case, circumstances forced our hand. There really is only one thing we're going to talk about. We'll do the War of the Rohirrim. We will do it. Yeah. We'll have an episode on it, but this is not a series. At least this is not a tendentious 2 seasons so far and worse series.
That. They might make a sequel.
You're right about that, but no, this is a one-off moment. It is coming up. It is something that by default will be a new version of it. It is something that will be the 4th major animated adaptation of Tolkien, if we count both the Rankin Basses and the Bakshees. So there is a weird sort of through line in that regard, indirect. But that is another context to put it in. And even though you've heard some of our initial qualms, we'll see where it lands. We will see what happens.
I would like to like it. I would like to like that. Yeah. That's cool.
And I have said before that I do have a slight personal interest in that one of the main producers is someone who I have known for a while, a fellow named Jason DeMarco. I will come into this fairly, but my hope is that he and the team have pulled it off. We will see. that
Right, you might regret naming this personal connection.
I mean, I got to be upfront about it. I can't lie. I've known him since well before the podcast, so it's just one of those things. I cannot pretend to be utterly unbiased. I will say that. So, but anyway, that will be what happens next time. So this is the final episode of 2024. We hope you have as peaceful and calm a holiday season as possible. That may be the best we can wish for everybody right now.
Yeah, rest up, everybody. Rest up.
Yeah, rest is good. Get through the darkest days of the year, so far, and we'll see where it goes. But we do wish you everyone very well, and we'd like to especially thank everyone who has been following us more recently on Blue Sky with the big explosion of attention that's happened over the past week and a half alone since from the time mentioned until the recording of this episode. I'm sure give it a couple more weeks. By the time this episode comes out, it'll be even more. We've got a lot more followers. We hope that means that we have a lot more listeners or people who are interested to hear what we do next. We hope you enjoy what you heard, and also our archive at this point. We've got quite a bit out there, so feel free to check through the website, which again is megaphonic.fm /By-The-Bywater, and you can find links to all our social media as well individually as hosts from there. So do please feel free to follow along. And as always, if you have a direct message besides contacting us or just dropping a line through social media, you can always write to By-The-Bywater by-the-bywater@gmail.com. That is about it for now. Thanks very much for listening. We absolutely appreciate it. Have a very good end of the year, everyone, and we will talk to you again in the new year. Until then.